Okay, thank you, Louisa. Now, like its aviation counterpart, the International Maritime Organization is also targeting net zero by 2050. And similarly, the switch to low carbon fuels has also been identified as the most important lever, right? However, unlike aviation, the discussions around what the fuel mix of the future of energy for maritime is a bit more multivariant than the aviation sector. The maritime sector is looking at a multi-fuel future which could involve LNG, biofuels, and various carriers of hydrogen. In particular, low-carbon methanol and low-carbon ammonia are discussed as having the most promise to structurally decarbonize the sector. Now, industry watchers have asked which will come first, if one will prevail over the other. Some say that both can coexist together. But point is, I think the transition is still fairly uncertain. Now, today our panel will discuss how this transition to methanol and ammonia could take place and discuss how the industry is dealing with these uncertainties. And ultimately, we want to discuss some high-impact unlocks that can help us scale these fuels. Now, first question to Lynn and Pernille. Right? In your organizations, you engage a lot with the industry players. Could you share with us, or help us dimensionalize how the industry is thinking about the differences between these two options, the pros and cons of adopting low-carbon methanol versus ammonia? Maybe we'll start with Lynn.
Sure. Thanks for having me, Nicholas. So like you said, the maritime sector is looking at various different kinds of fuels. That's because the shipping sector is very heterogeneous, and with a heterogeneous sector requires a heterogeneous portfolio set of solutions. So there's no one size fit all. So let's just start there. Whether methanol or ammonia, which is the subject of today's discussion, I would say these are very different fuels, but there are also new use cases as marine fuel. So let's talk about their similarity and differences. Methanol is a liquid at room temperature. Ammonia is a gas with a boiling temperature at -33 degrees Celsius. Because of these inherent differences, there are going to be manifestations of these differences. To say the least, methanol is also has also been adopted. We've seen bunkering, and ammonia is coming later on still. So because of these differences, I think we're going to continue to look at them, and we're just going to have to proceed. And different shipping companies will have different solutions depending on what they see.
So I'm hearing maybe methanol is slightly more ready for adoption, then comes ammonia. Pernille, are you hearing the same thing from the audience you engage with?
Yeah, I think obviously everything, I agree to everything Lynn she said. And in terms of what's coming first, well, we already have methanol vessels on the water, and methanol is technically available and possible. So yes, that comes first. On ammonia, there's still a set of challenges in terms of the safety, in terms of the certification. And we have had the first trial bunkering here in Singapore. That went well, but there's still a number of issues to be solved. But I think what's also important when talking about the fuel, and especially looking at the first, say, the time until 2030, where IMO is having a target of reduce or having minimum 5 and ideally 10% of the fuel being green, is that methanol will provide, likely according to our analysis, 1%. Ammonia has the potential to provide another 1%, and biofuel can provide the last 1%. That leaves us with ideally 7% that has to come from somewhere, and that leads us to green methane. So I actually think that green methane is not the perfect substitution for black fuel, but it is a very important element in the transition, especially when we look at the short and medium terms.
Interesting. I think let's come back to green methane a bit later in the discussion.
Yeah.
But I think one of the most commonly discussed points or things said about ammonia is it's toxic. And we've discussed how we've already known how to handle methanol at scale, and similarly, it's not the first time we're handling ammonia industrially at scale as well. So could you help us appreciate how exactly is bunkering ammonia more toxic and different from how we are already handling ammonia out there today? Lynn, you guys recently did a study on this issue. Could you share some insights there?
Yeah, so I mean, today, I think what you're referring to is a transfer of cargo. So ship-to-ship transfer of cargo has been done with ammonia. Bunkering is slightly different. So bunkering is still transferring of ammonia, but you're transferring it to the fuel tank. And so because it's a bunkering activity, it happens within port limits. Its frequency is much higher than if you were to just do cargo transfer. Cargo transfer can go from ship to shore as well. So in Singapore, that happens probably twice a month at a terminal that's not within, crowded port limits, etc. So I think because of these differences, the risk portfolio looks very different, and therefore one needs to understand the risk that's associated with bunkering. That's why we did our safety study. Just to provide some context, before the safety study, I think we talked about bunkering ammonia, but we didn't know whether it was going to be safe or whether it was possible to bunker ammonia. So the safety study allowed us to then take one more step forward to sort of say, okay, given the kinds of scenario that we're looking at for potential bunkering, we identified 400 different kinds of locational and operational risk, and all of these risks can be mitigated. This gives us an indication that we can move forward to the next step to look at what happens next. We wanted to be very, very specific, so the safety study was actually done with the context of Singapore in mind. We identified 4 locations in Singapore that we looked at potentially bunkering ammonia. 2 are land sites, so one is at the Advario terminal, looking at specific volumetric flow rates of 1,500 cubic meters per hour. And then looking at the Vopak site, so this is a shore-to-ship, which was subsequently just recently demonstrated by MPA. Yep. And then we looked at the anchorage as well. And again, with these different very specific sites, the risks that were looked at were all deemed mitigatable. So I think it's very encouraging, and so what we're trying to do now is to take the next step. With this study, we've submitted it to standards development organizations. They're going to use it to develop standards both locally as well as with SGMF. So this is international standards. It's been submitted to Singapore Maritime Academy to be incorporated into safety training. And then last but not least, we're using this as a basis to work with port authorities to develop regulatory sandbox so that we can actually demonstrate this transfer of ammonia between 2 gas carriers as a first step to get the ecosystem comfortable with the idea of using ammonia as a marine fuel.
Yeah, I think, and then therefore, I think it's just a matter of time soon before we can handle all these fuels at scale, right?
Well, I mean, I think so. Time is relative, yeah? Yep. So just to give you sort of a sense, the technical reference for LNG took 8 years to develop. So what we're hoping to do here is to compress that timeline because we really don't have time to lose.
Got it. And now moving on to James and Margaux. So Pernille just said we potentially might be dealing with a lot of fuels in 2030. Now you guys own assets. You guys need to make decisions on what fuels you use, what ships you buy. How are your organizations navigating these uncertainties?
Yeah, so thank you. Look, it's interesting when we talk about transition because obviously a ship's life is 25 years. So if you make the wrong decision and you're stuck with that for 25 years, it's also too long. So I think at Berge, we're a large dry bulk ship owner. We have around about 90 large ships, and last year we carried around about 100 million tons. So we have a big footprint. And we have, a relatively simple strategy. I think it's simple. It's obviously very complicated as we go through it. But I talk about four prongs of attack, and I use the sort of war metaphor because I do think we are on a war against climate change. I think everyone in the room agrees with that. But using another shipping metaphor, it's all hands on deck, and we're trying to move as quickly as possible. So our four prongs are firstly, and it's something that we've been doing for the last 15 years, is try to address our existing legacy fleet, make it more efficient. And actually, there's a lot you can do. So over the last 15 years, we've built bigger, better, more efficient ships. We go slower, we use better route optimization. And actually, the net result is a 45% saving versus the fleet that we would have had back when we started in 2007, 2008. So it's something tangible. The second part of our strategy is to use new technology. So this is, again, not coming to fuels, but that's new technology on our existing legacy fleet again. So that's things like we're testing bubbles underneath the ship, better paint, remote control robots to clean fouling under the ship. Again, better technology on route optimization, and many different things. We've actually added recently some large wings on our ships which provide wind assistant. We've just done our first voyage, kind of very exciting results as well. So these are all, wind is not exactly new technology, by the way, but it's an application of new technology, of old technology. We call it sort of back to the future, but it's a kind of exciting development where we have these new technologies. We then come on to our third prong, which is around new fuel. And I would say, we're talking about methanol and ammonia, but again, in terms of actually what we can do today, it's kind of those first 2 points more than necessarily methanol and ammonia, because it's going to take us some time. Within that category of new fuels, though, is also biofuel, which we can drop in today, and obviously we're looking very heavily at that. We have just ordered our first ammonia fuel ships, so they're coming sort of 2027, so it's on the way, and it's the first start of our process. But also within new fuels is also potentially nuclear fuel, whether that's as a source of energy, or actually potentially longer term on the ships themselves. And just the fourth part of our strategy is around carbon capture. So we still think, again, particularly for our legacy fleet, and bearing in mind, as Pernille just said, there is not enough biofuel ammonia available in the near term. So we really must concentrate on our legacy fleet. So we are looking and testing carbon capture, both on board, and we really believe that is an important area for us. And then when the carbon that we can't capture on board, we're very focused around offsets, direct air carbon capture, trying to do our bit on land. Again, this is more of a voluntary basis, but we have just done our first kind of net, or we now have to, I don't know if we can call it net zero anymore, but we could call it a kind of offset voyage where we actually bought offsets through Climate Impact Exchange here in Singapore, and are very big supporters of carbon capture, where we can't do it ourselves physically on board. We'll do it onshore. So altogether, I actually call it the Marshall Plan, as again, reference back to huge infrastructure spend. There's a lot of money we need to spend, but if we have a maritime Marshall Plan to really push forward that agenda, I think we're making progress.
And I think staying on the third sort of lever in that plan, as it relates to the debate today, you have to buy a ship now. Do you choose a methanol ship, or do you choose a ammonia-ready ship, and why?
So we've gone through that whole process, and I don't think there's necessarily a right answer. The first move for us was looking at LNG, actually, as a dual-fueled LNG. And we took the decision a bit, as I mentioned before, that we feel that LNG is maybe a transitionary fuel, but for shipping, if I invest in LNG, it's a 25-year investment. The infrastructure is a 25-year, so I prefer to kind of move to the next stage, which I think is methanol or ammonia. In our case, we're happy to do methanol. As Lynn mentioned, it's in a sense it's an easier transition for us. But really, I also see that as an offset type of fuel. I'm almost better, and it's only we have committed. We're committed to growing 25 million trees in a big program in Africa. But I prefer to really leave those trees in the ground rather than kind of put it into methanol. So in some respects, I think we're going straight towards ammonia as a decision. More complicated, difficult to introduce as a fuel into shipping, but I kind of feel that's the longer term solution as a zero carbon fuel. So
I think it depends on whether you see it as an infrastructure limitation or where the bottleneck is. If production is a bottleneck, then one might think that you would lean more towards ammonia, because for every 3 equivalent of hydrogen, you generate 2 equivalents of ammonia, and you only generate 1 equivalent of methanol. And the methanol, you still need that carbon from somewhere, right? And so you need that biogenic carbon or direct air captured carbon in order for methanol to be really low carbon. But if you see infrastructure as the bottleneck, then you would go for methanol because it's a liquid, the infrastructure is more straightforward. So I think it depends on how you kind of slice the pie.
Agree. And we'll come back to maybe dig into that a bit more later. Margaux, we've seen James's war chest. What's in Trafigura's?
It's kind of hard to go after the Marshall Plan, but I'll
change your name.
It doesn't sound as good as the war plan, unfortunately. But just to give you a bit of an idea, as a global commodities trader, yes, we own some assets, but we also are kind of present along the entire value chain and how we're thinking about decarbonization as a multi-fuel transition future. We're doing a lot of work on the technology side. We're actually co-sponsoring the development of the 2-stroke ammonia engine with MAN, which will be ready in 2025 for orders, which is really exciting. We are also, we have methanol barges on time charter currently, not too far around here actually. We're not in the business of making bets. We are here to supply to our customers. So, on top of the ammonia engine development, we have also been advocating for mass flow meters. We've done a lot of things around coatings, et cetera, just to really kind of encourage not just the decarbonization, but also the efficiency of the industry. I think probably the last 10, 15 years in shipping has been all about efficiency. And now we're adding something that is highly complex, that's at a very high premium, that is going to create a lot of inefficiencies, which is what maybe we'll talk about later on. But technology, we're also now developing projects ourselves to produce low carbon hydrogen, and then the derivatives, whether it's ammonia or methanol. Again, we're kind of following where our customers want to go, so we're quite agnostic in that sense. And then, of course, we have a bunkering business that is currently supplying biofuels and all the conventional fuels, and we'll be able to do the same for ammonia and methanol. So we're trying to hedge our bets. We recognize that all fuels and all solutions are going to be needed. You talked about carbon capture. Something that we haven't mentioned yet, but would love to talk more about, is methane abatement on LNG vessels. That's something as well that's really important. We can't just think about endgame. We need to think about decarbonization now, too.
So as an energy trader as well, or energy supplier as well, and recognizing that we might be dealing with a future where we need many fuels ready for bunkering, how do you think the future of bunkering infrastructure will change?
I think we are transitioning to a very complex environment for shipping. I mean, if you look at pre-IMO 2020, there was essentially one fuel. Since we probably have a couple of iterations, maybe 3, 4, 5, depending on what you want to call a different fuel. So that's already created a fair amount of complexity, I'd say compounded with the regulation that we are seeing and the specifications of certain customers. We are seeing extremely complex and inefficient infrastructure for shipping probably in the near future, which means costs are going up. So it's a fantastic role for a trader because it's there for optimizing, but I think we need to understand that the decarbonization of shipping is going to create quite a lot of fragmentation and inefficiencies, and probably in the near term is going to increase emissions, not decrease. If you look at what happened with IMO 2020, which was all about reducing sulfur, we ended up increasing CO2 emissions.
Correct. And I think just staying on that point, I think Lynn mentioned it's important to recognize that there is a potential bottleneck in supply.
Yeah.
Right now, as an energy supplier, project developer yourself, where do you see the future of these supply hubs emerging?
Yeah, so I'd kind of unpack it into two responses. On the first front, I mean, we talked about biofuels, we talked about kind of e-methane, but also biomethane. When we look at the availability of those types of feedstocks, we need to remember that a lot of other industries are going to be competing for that same feedstock. And whilst road transport's probably the highest willingness to pay, aviation's pretty good, shipping's the worst. So I think if we believe that there are going to be feedstocks left for shipping, we are overestimating the willingness to pay of shipping. So on one front, when it comes to biomethanol, biomethane, I think that those are going to be super constrained. Even if there is feedstock available, it is not going to go into shipping. On the flip side, whether it's e-methane, e-methanol, e-ammonia, We see significant potential for the production of those fuels, not in Europe and not in the US, which is where most of the projects are being developed currently, but actually in fast emerging countries, the ones along the equator, where you have fantastic renewable resources, where yes, you do need to build the infrastructure for export, but we see significant potential for cost competitive e-fuels coming from those regions.
I think, and yet, while it's possible to scale up supply in these regions that you mentioned, ultimately the elephant in the room we're trying to address here is that these fuels cost a lot more than incumbent fuels, right? And until we find a way to make these fuels pay for itself, it's hard to imagine anyone actually financing now these projects. Often when we come to such discussions, policy is a useful or key unlock. Now, Margaux, you mentioned earlier about the IMO 2020, right? So IMO 2020 was super effective in lowering sulfur levels in fuel. Why can't we use a similar type of mandate levers to actually achieve the same outcomes, to force the market to adopt methanol, low carbon ammonia? Maybe a question for Pernille and Lynn.
I think it's a bit of different, say, problem. There's one solution to reducing the sulfur in 2020 is one goes for everybody. Going out and say that by 2050 we can only accept ammonia vessels, I think will meet a lot of resistance in very many different ways. I think what the IMO can do is that they can put in a carbon levy, which in many ways would achieve exactly the same thing. And listening to this in parallel with the Ecosperity, there's also the Singapore Maritime Week going on, where Senor Dominguez from the IMO, he was having his opening speech today, and he's very confident that in 2025 we will agree on both technical and economic midterm measures, which will include some kind of a carbon levy. And I think both from an industry perspective, but also from a global, say, do good for the world perspective, the only right thing would be to have a solid carbon levy, which is a nice, or you could say that would easily be explainable because it compensates for the ecological or the environmental damage that you do by using heavy fuel. So having a levy that hits everybody in the same way is creating a nice level playing field. And that would actually solve the issue. And I think also when you talk about the cost, yes, there's a cost to it, but there's also, we tend to compare it to today, but there's also a cost to doing nothing. So if we compare the do nothing scenario with the pay for the green fuel that we have to pay, my bet, and at least our analysis shows that the green future is way less costly than the do nothing future. So I think it's quite important to have that aspect in mind as well.
So I think a carbon levy is ultimately a market-based measure, right? So I think back to the IMO 2020 question, like Lynn, would you also agree that market-based measures like carbon levy would be the most effective, or would a mandate to standardize the market?
Well, I mean, I think it needs to be a hybrid of both, right? I think a carbon levy is with a carbon price. Let's just call it a price, whether it's a levy or not. I mean, IMO can decide. Pricing, polluting the environment is really important. That's on the one hand, we need that. On the other hand, I think we do need a mandate. So a robust fuel standard could be really useful. So for example, the green balance mechanism that was proposed by the World Shipping Council, that's good because it has both that comes in. That's something that's being weighed by the IMO heavily. Because not only do you want to be able to price this, when you have a fuel standard that basically says, the shipping should see a 2% or whatever percent reduction in emissions, that dictates what kind of fuel could be used and what kind of fuel would no longer be eligible when it comes time. So then I guess the benefits from the tax can then be used to fund and support the front runners who choose to adopt fuels that actually meet or exceed these fuel standards, right?
So we talked about,
or even it could be used to accelerate the fuel production. So I think that there are various ways of doing that kind of earmark and return. You can either do it specifically to the narrow maritime industry, or you can look at the full ecosystem and say where one of the big bottlenecks is actually in the fuel production.
Yeah.
So if the money is channeled over there, that would accelerate the whole transition as well.
yeah, and I think at the IMO level, there's a lot being debated as to how this sort of levy system could be administrated, how the funds are collected, where is it spent, right? But since we talked about carbon price, quick fire round, let's go down the row. How much is enough?
Well,
Carbon price.
if we start here, well, that depends on the way you construct it. So if you do that earmark and return, you would need less to decarbonize the maritime industry. And we have made various studies. You can construct it in different ways. Somewhere between $100 and $200 would make the trick if you do it in a smart way. If you do it in a less smart way, you might hit as much as 300 or even more.
So 100 to 200. Lynn?
I would agree with that ballpark number, though. I mean, I think if you look at removal technologies, and you heard from this morning's panel, right? I mean, it's a lot more expensive than that. And if you talk about direct air capture, which is a technology that's going to be needed, granted outside of shipping, that could be upwards of $500 to $1,000 a ton. So it's all over the map, but we do need to price in these externalities in order to move forward.
Do you guys agree with that?
So we published a white paper back in 2020. I think we were one of the first privately owned companies to advocate for carbon pricing in the shipping industry. And based on the work that we looked at fuel parity, so not really including infrastructure, but just looking at fuel parity, the number came up to $200 a ton. Just to also to mention, you know, IMO 2020 took 15 years, right? We're hoping to accelerate that rate of change 100%. But back in 2020, when we published this white paper, people thought we were nuts. And so it's been great, you know, since to see the change and the messaging. And recent press has been indicating that there are discussions at the IMO about $100 a ton by 2030, which is great. We need to see more happen.
Yeah, I would agree. I mean, I think if we talk about the cost, as Lynn mentioned, of direct air carbon capture and also the cost of the e-fuels coming, and bearing in mind there has to be an e-fuel if it's to make sense. I mean, we're talking a huge premium. So frankly, $200 is not going to be enough to incentivize us to change. So I think it, you know, at a minimum, it needs to be that, probably more, and there will need to be more sort of customer acceptance that we have to pass on the cost as well. I think we spent a lot of time debating where the proceeds of that tax will go. As Lynn mentioned again, I mean, it's really just a carbon tax. As long as the fuel is, everyone's prepared to pay the higher price of the fuel, then, you know, we'll transition as quickly as possible. We mentioned when we transitioned from, you know, heavy sulfur fuel to low sulfur fuel, you know, it was a $200-300 premium on the fuel, kind of almost instantaneously. It's dropped down a bit, but it had a very big impact, but was passed on, you know, instantaneously. So it is possible to pass it on. In the scheme of it, even if it was a higher tax, and, you know, it actually, when you put it on a freight, especially on our large ships, if we carry a ton of iron ore, you know, yes, it will double the cost of the freight, but it's still maybe $10 a ton. We pay today about $10 a ton to move, you know, 200,000 tons from Australia to China. If we doubled that price, you know, crazy. I negotiate, you know, for days over cents and a dollar on a freight rate. But actually, if you could just jump in and say $10 a ton in shipping, it's not, you know, it's not that much in the end of it. You know, the market is flexible. Iron ore costs, you know, somewhere between $100 and $150 a ton. So to add another $10 of freight is not so much. If you go down to the end user, you know, eventually when we're at a Tesla, you know, are you prepared to pay $10 more when you buy a 50,000 pound car? You know, I know there's a lot of other instruments, you know, a lot of other costs down the road, but from a freight shipping perspective, you know, it should be passable on, you know, to the end user. So I'm confident we'll get there eventually. It's that trigger that we need to, you know, to get over the line, and there I think carbon pricing would be very helpful to push that along.
So sorry to interrupt, but I think the one fuel that we didn't talk about is the blue fuels, right? I mean, we've been talking about the green fuels and then the transition fuels. I think the blue fuels will come much sooner. So the green stuff will come through the developing countries, like you say, where there's a lot of sunshine, so you have a lot of renewable electricity.
Maybe for the benefit of some.
Yeah, so I'm going to come back and say what the blue is.
Correct.
So it's basically gray fuel, so gray ammonia or gray methanol, but then you capture the CO2 that's being produced, and then you sink that CO2 into the ground, so making that process less carbon intensive. I think I'm bullish about blue fuels. I think it's going to come from America because of all the IRA incentives, provided that these class 6 wells for carbon capture gets built. So the permitting is a bottleneck currently. But if those wells get built, I think the first low carbon fuels that we will see, ammonia, methanol, whatever, will be the blue stuff. And again, if the class 6 wells get permitted fast, this fuel will come quick because the gray ammonia is already being produced. And because of IRA incentives, these lower carbon fuels could be just incrementally more expensive than gray fuels today. So I think in that sense, it could be a game changer. And again, it really depends on all the regulations to allow carbon capture to be done at scale, so the blue fuels could be produced.
Ultimately, it's going to be about carbon intensity, right?
Sure,
so,
absolutely.
As you were talking about earlier, kind of a fuel standard, in the white paper we wrote in 2020, we referenced the California Low Carbon Fuel Standard, right? So kind of basing it on a pathway of production, distribution, delivery to your customer. This is the carbon intensity of your value of your supply chain. And so it should be carbon intensity based ultimately. But I would agree on, blue ammonia specifically will come faster. And I think the blue volumes and the biomethanol volumes will be a lot more cost competitive than the e-fuels and probably more readily available for shipping as a result.
I think interestingly, we ourselves being an investor in this space, we were also hearing sort of similar trends in that, hey, what was once a very green discussion is now shifting blue a bit. So let's see. But James, since you mentioned willingness to pay, there was a interesting question that came in, right? So while we sit here and debate around what is the appropriate price, when will it come in, meaning carbon price, the IEA in, I think, 2023 launched a report that said, hey, even if all these things didn't happen, we pass the cost on, that would just mean more than just maybe increasing an avocado price by 1 cent, right? So any reactions to that? Like, why do we even need all these policies anymore when we can just pass it on?
Well, I can't pass on $10 at the moment. It's as simple as that on my freight. As I said, I argue about cents every day when I'm pricing my ship. So to pass on and double my freight overnight, frankly, my customers are not there to do it. I think on a voluntary basis, some are starting, we can talk, and even ourselves have agreed to do voluntary basis of cheaper credits, which is on the different end of the scale. But if we're talking about e-fuels or even biofuels, frankly, I can do biofuels today. I'm offering my customer biofuel all the time and saying I'm ready to drop it in. I can use a biofuel today, and they're simply not ready to pay for it yet, on the basis that no one else is paying for it. So it's that kind of chicken and egg basis. I hope there may be a few flagship projects where people will try to get some press about it and make a few flagships, but fundamentally we're not able to pass it on yet.
Not all shipping is created equal, unfortunately, and so whether it's the bulk space or the tanker space, right, it's very difficult to pass on to your customers. But if you are a container line and you're selling ultimately freight to Nike, that's a much easier story to make. And I would say we agree 1 to 2% inflation from you switching to low carbon fuels.
Yeah, I think thanks for teasing that. I think there are many reports out there that sort of simplify this discussion too much, and saying that, hey, just make the avocado 1 cent more and we're all fine. But I think the reality is not everybody ships avocados, right? Now, maybe just to wrap up this discussion, Singapore is the largest bunkering hub in the world. Now, if you had just one message as a call to action, what is top of mind for you in trying to get, if there's only one thing that Singapore should focus on what is the highest impact action that Singapore can do to catalyze the transition to low carbon methanol and ammonia? And maybe we'll go down this way.
Only one. I've already got listed out 4 that I need them to do. But I mean, look, we've just and given that it's a methanol ammonia, and we've placed our first order for ammonia-fueled ships. Obviously encourage Singapore to be a ammonia bunkering place. The technology for our ship is still not completely tested, not ready. It will be by the time the ship delivers. But we don't know where we're going to get our fuel yet from, and we don't know where we're going to bunker it from. So it's either going to be, for us, China, Australia, Singapore, or Brazil. And I think, obviously Singapore would be a great place to do it. So
focusing on catalyzing ammonia.
Yeah.
I guess it's a bit of a boring one, but enforcing carbon pricing and fuel standards.
I would say just be brave in general, and the transition is going to be messy. We know the end point. The transition is going to be messy. We are going to probably make mistakes. We just need to be brave and kind of embrace the uncertainty and move ahead. And the one specific example that I have is ammonia as well, simply because we've been thinking about ammonia. I am reminded of our survey that we did with BCG, and that survey, we surveyed 128 respondents, and of the front runners, 70% of the front runners said they want to adopt ammonia by 2029. 2029 is not that far away, and in order for you to have the infrastructure, like to support James's company, ready by 2029, we need to start thinking about ammonia now, today. And so it's working together to ready the ecosystem, building that infrastructure. It's contextualizing this information for the seafarers, training the seafarers, getting the entire ecosystem comfortable with the idea that we're going to be having a new marine fuel in the ecosystem. So all that needs to all come together, the soft stuff as well as the hard stuff. And that takes the entire ecosystem to play well together to get there.
Thank you, Lynn.
We need it by 27, 28.
Yeah, there you go.
The ship's arriving.
I think Singapore is doing a lot of right things and continue to exactly just do it. Try it out, make the mistakes, try again. Certainly, I think if I had one wish, that would be that, a little bit along the lines of Margaux, that Singapore is very actively pushing for both technical and so the fuel standards and also the carbon taxing in IMO. So pushing maybe directly in IMO, but also the countries that you have close relationships to establish those very solid fuel standards, ensure that we get a carbon tax, because those two, they go hand in hand and they're extremely critical to accelerate the whole transition.
Okay, thanks, Pernille. So I think let me wrap up this discussion quickly with maybe just 3 takeaways I took away from our discussion, right? So we've been debating for the past 40 minutes, sort of a debate, on how this whole transition to low carbon methanol ammonia could play out. It does seem that methanol could be more ready for adoption first, but it also does seem that the industry does have a preference for ammonia because it structurally decouples you from carbon, right? But I think there's also a recognition that we need a lot more time to actually realize this future for ammonia to come into play, green or blue, all right? The second takeaway for me is in playing out this transition, I think industry players are navigating the possibility of the multi-fuel future in many ways. I think, James, you mentioned, using transition fuels. You are thinking about asset strategy very carefully. You've also got other strategies like carbon capture, etc., etc. But I think what was common on the panel here as well is ultimately it's important that policy comes into play very strongly, be it fuel mandates, be it carbon levy, carbon prices. I think these all have to come into play strongly, and Singapore has a I would say, catalytic role in actually enabling all this to happen. I think with that, please join me in thanking our panelists. Thank you.